Pre-fertilization, pollination. Pollination is very important. It leads to the creation of new seeds that grow into new plants. The transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of a pistil is called pollination. Based on the source of pollen, pollination is of three types: autogamy, geitonogamy, xenogamy. Autogamy: transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of the same flower. Requirement: synchrony in pollen release and stigma receptivity. Closeness of stigma and anther. Chasmogamous flowers, flowers with exposed anthers and stigma. Cleistogamous flowers, flowers which do not open at all. Cleistogamy is disadvantageous because there is no chance of variation. Example: oxalis, viola. Geitonogamy: transfer of pollen grain to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. Genetically similar. Example: cucurbits. Xenogamy: transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of another flower of different plant. Genetically different pollen grains are brought to the stigma. Agents of pollination. 1. Abiotic agents. A. Wind. B. Water. 2. Biotic agents. A. Insects. B. Birds. C. Bats. D. Reptiles. E. Mammals. Adaptations in flowers for pollination. 1. Wind pollination. Pollen grains: light, non-sticky, winged. Anther: well exposed. Stigma: large and feathery. Flower: one ovule arranged as inflorescence. Example: corn cob, cotton, date palm. 2. Water pollination. Bryophytes, pteridophytes, algae. Pollen grains protected by mucilaginous covering. Example: freshwater plants, Vallisneria hydrilla, seagrass, Zostera. Main features of wind and water pollinated plants: produce pollen grains in large number. Do not produce nectar. 3. Insect pollination. Flowers: large, colorful, fragrant, rich in nectar. Pollen grains: sticky. Stigma: sticky. Outbreeding devices. Continued self-pollination. Inbreeding depression. Ways to avoid self-pollination. 1. Pollen release and stigma receptivity not synchronized. 2. Stigma and anther placed at different positions. 3. Self-incompatibility. 4. Production of unisexual flowers. Example: castor, maize prevents autogamy. Papaya prevents autogamy and geitonogamy. Pollen-pistil interaction. All events from deposition of pollen on stigma till the pollen tube enters the ovule is called pollen-pistil interaction. Recognition of compatible pollen. Germination of pollen grains. Development of male gametophyte. Artificial hybridization. Crossing different varieties of species, hybrid individual, with desirable characters of the parent plants. Desired pollen grains for pollination. Stigma protected from contamination. Emasculation, removal of anther. Bagging flower-covered bag made up of butter paper prevent contamination of stigma from unwanted pollen.